Hello, everyone. My name is Sujata, and I'm the host for today's webinar. And I'm working as South Asia Gender Equality and Social Inclusion Lead, and working with Includovate, yes, definitely. And we as Includovate have started a thought series where we want to reflect and discuss on the work that we do. So for this particular purpose, we have a number of webinars. So this is second in the series today. We have already had the first one, which was on Saturday, that is on 30th of January. And that was on social inclusion. And we are continuing the same topic. So the first webinar was on how inclusive are the social service delivery and how it is relevant. So building on that, the topic for today's webinar is what is social inclusion? Yes, that is really a difficult question, but a simple answer is leaving no one behind. No, it's not that simple. It's really complicated. And and luckily we have two panelists who were there in the first webinar, and we heard them. We heard them talk about social inclusion, and Kristie touched upon an aspect when I say what is social inclusion. So she said that yes, the more the number of exclusion vectors are, the harder the life is. For example, women with disability living below the poverty line is more vulnerable as compared to a woman with a disability in a rich family. So yes, then what's the solution? The solution was touched upon by Sisay, another panelist who reflected in the first webinar on 30th of January that the program design needs to be inclusive. So what do we mean by this? Inclusive? Yes, we need to ensure that everyone, irrespective of caste, gender, ethnicity, and any other exclusion criteria, they need to be included in the program design. We need to ensure that they have access to resources, to opportunities, they participate without discrimination, they have the decision-making power, the governance needs to be inclusive, and definitely well-being for all. So here I stop after introducing the topic for today's webinar, and let me now introduce the panelist. So I request Kristie to please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Sujata, for having to unmute myself. So my name is Kristie Drucza. I'm the CEO and founder of Includovate, which is a research incubator designed to help a community of researchers in the Global South. Irene, I think you need to mute. I'm getting some background noise coming from your speaker. Thank you. Yeah, and we also want to get more researchers from the Global South publishing on topics that are localized, experienced differently, depend on context, to be involved in shaping what does that mean. And so later on, I'll be talking a bit about the theory of social inclusion, and it'll touch on how it's so individual. And that makes it very challenging to talk about, particularly outside of a certain culture, a certain identity. It gets a bit messy. So that's all from me. I'll hand over now to Irene to introduce herself.
Irene, you are on mute.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Irene Mutambo. I'm a social researcher with Includovate based in Kampala. Nice meeting you all.
Thanks, Kristie. Thanks, Irene. Sisay, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I am Sisay Mammo. I myself am a person with disability, or I always say I'm born and design blind. And I have been working as Disability Portfolio Lead for Includovate up to 31 of January. And now I'm part of Includovate family, and I'm in the board, but and I also supporting the disability portfolio, but not as a staff of Includovate as of today. I will be speaking more what in our first webinar has jotted out, that social inclusion is both a process and an outcome. So it's I will add on what she said about this, and I will also address questions forwarded by the host. Thank you.
Thanks, Sisay. Kristie, now I like the main discussion starts. So please unpack this theory behind social inclusion and what are the elements associated with it. Over to you, Kristie.
Thank you, Sujata. I had to prepare some notes on this one because it is a slippery topic, and it's defined in the literature differently by different academics, and it's often defined in different contexts, as you mentioned earlier, Sujata. And then there is levels to it. So I'm going to try and explain some of that now. There's an emotional aspect is what we first have to understand about exclusion. The experience of exclusion, it gets to feelings, and that's a bit nebulous. How does one study feelings, and how does one prove that someone has a grievance or is missing out if it's not in a policy written down? It's about interactions and relationships. So social inclusion has to involve an exploration of relationships of power. And this can be between individuals, it can be between states and citizens. Often when it comes to exclusion, there's a group aspect to it. So a lot of conflict, when you trace back the history to why it started, there'll be one group who has more than the other, more power, more land, more opportunity. And another group who are trying to say, we don't have those same opportunities, we're excluded. But within that grouping, there can be different forms of exclusion as well. As Sujata was mentioning earlier, for example, disabilities. What this gets, so Frances Stewart talks about horizontal inequalities and vertical inequalities. Sorry, horizontal, vertical. I should stop using my hands. And that they actually add little value to society because someone can be held back because of their identity, not because of their ability, not because of their education. And what this does over time is reduces aspirations. So a country does not get the most out of its people. It does not deliver the most for its people, because certain people will be excluded because of the language they speak, the religion they believe in, or whatever else is not considered in the mainstream. And this is difficult for a group to lobby or to negotiate with a state. So you can see how it's starting to get very tricky. And when it comes to power, of course, there's the aspect of I dominate you, I can do violence, I have power and authority and I assert that. But then there's other forms of power, such as agenda setting power. I can write a policy and you can't. I get to represent you in Parliament and shape your identity. That's all power. Then there's other topics, I suppose, that interact with social inclusion to help understand it, such as social closure. Some groups might monopolize certain industries in a market or certain institutions, and they close out that opportunity to other groups. Other groups may be included in other ways, but before long, it's that one part that they're excluded from that they'll often want to be included in, and that's where grievances can come. Social inclusion has individual aspects because how I perceive being excluded might be different to the person next to me, because there's personality as well as culture, language, and past experience that comes into it. And this is where it becomes hard to solve because different solutions are also needed. I was going to say, it's discrimination's involved. It's central. There's an aspect of discrimination which is very central to exclusion. Nala Kabir, it mentions that social exclusion is the denial of full personhood and full citizenship to certain groups on the basis of who they are, where they live, and what they believe. So Sisay and I have had a conversation around banking. So in order for him to get money out of banks in Ethiopia as a visually impaired person, he needs someone with him. He can't do that by himself. Now that's excluding him. That's also reducing the rights that he has to banking. The bank may be horrified to hear that they're breaching his rights. They've never thought about it that way before because they have embodied the idea of some have and some don't, but we need this in order for our policies and for our security, all of which are true. But then looking at the human aspect and what that means when it plays out is where it can be challenging, firstly, because there's a time aspect. So when Sisay is a child, if he wants to do banking, obviously you have someone with you. So as a child, it's not a big deal. But as he gets older, it becomes an issue. Same thing with unemployed. Long-term unemployment leads to health outcomes. But the unemployed don't have those arguments at the time they're unemployed to say, give me a job. So there's a time aspect. It was already mentioned as a process, it's an outcome. We've talked about individual aspects. We've talked about relationships, feelings. This is what makes social inclusion such a complicated term to solve and to study. I'm going to stop there. Sujata, I can go on and on. I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Kristie. This is really informative. So I was just trying to pick the key words from the topic that you discussed. So definitely, yes, we have these horizontal and the vertical inequalities. Social inclusion is something that's really emotionally attached. There are different levels to it. There are power relations. There is time aspect. It's a process. So definitely a lot more can be discussed, but yes, and we would love to hear you continue this, like speaking on this topic. But now we move on to Sisay. So are there any difference how persons with disabilities can access resources or information to ensure that they have full participation in the civil society? Sisay? Sisay, you are on mute. You are on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Should I repeat the question?
Yeah.
Okay. So are there any
okay, you can repeat.
Okay. So are there any
Are there? Go ahead.
Yes. Okay. Are there any difference with persons with disability accessing information or resources to ensure full participation in the civil society?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, let me explain by, I hope you're listening to me.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So let me a bit explain about what, social inclusion can mean as an outcome and as a process, particularly taking persons with disabilities into consideration. And I will also consider the points that you have raised now. Yeah, social inclusion is not an overnight, that we can make a decision to be social inclusive. but when we make that decision, unless we have the appropriate knowledge how to address that, it's not something that you can do it only by making decision. That makes it social inclusion a process. The decision can be an outcome. For example, many countries have ratified the United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That's an outcome that these countries have decided to become socially inclusive. And yet, ratification of the convention is one thing, but implementing in accordance with the convention is something totally different. So when it comes, that will be a process. When it comes to persons with disabilities, when they, of course, they face lots of challenge in relation to accessing information and getting access to resources. And of course, one of the main exclusionary factor in relation to persons with disabilities is the fact that their contact or their relationship with these access to information. Because people with disabilities cannot make an access to information in the way that people without disabilities do. If you take, for example, disabilities who have functional limitation on seeing difficulty, they cannot access resources the way that those who can see. Because mostly the access to information law is designed in a manner that it's possible to do it by seeing or by hearing. I mean, by using all sense organs, maybe except the smelling part. So when it comes to disability, because these elements on the one, because there is a body functional limitation upon that denies abilities, it creates one barrier, what we call this environmental barrier to access to information. And this will be aggravated by the fact that the access to information mechanisms are not inclusive. They are not inclusive. They always are made by laws of the majority, but not the laws of all. So the majority, for example, can use their sight to access the information, or they can use their hand to operate machines, whatever. But this does not apply to all. So because of that norm, rather, instead of saying law, because of that norm, a barrier will be created. So even if you try to create an accessible environment, as long as there is this kind of barrier, it's difficult to make sure that people with all kinds of disabilities are included. So two laws. One, there is a body functional limitation. Unless technology addresses that body functional limitation, it will be challenged, and that body functional limitation is accompanied by a law that does not consider, after all, the presence of those limitations. When we ask about inclusiveness, we are asking that there are people who have diverse abilities, who have limitations, just not like those of us without who consider ourselves as without disabilities. I mean, it is true that all people have their own limitations, but the issue is as to whether that limitation is acknowledged or not acknowledged. So that's one kind of barrier that denies. Another barrier is that even if there are technologies, even if there are mechanisms that ensure the possibility of, accessing to information, but that cannot reach people because of the expensiveness or the very high price. I mean, for me, for example, computer is an issue of survival. Like it looks like for me a pen and pencil, for me at least, for blind people like me. It's really it's like for me, it's a matter of survival, but for somebody else, it could be a luxury. I remember when I buy my first desktop computer, taking a loan of 1 year of my salary, 1 year or 2 years, I guess, at that time. It was a Pentium 2 computer, some 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, I don't know. Someone was telling me, you are doing something luxurious. But no, it was not luxurious for me. It was a matter of survival, because I mean, it's the way that I express myself, it's the way that I read books, it's the way that I write. So even if I mean, for me, it was so challenging. So then getting software is another challenge. So it's, I mean, there are 3 layers of barriers, you see. 1, there is a body functional limitation barrier. 2, there is a barrier of, design. Some softwares, for example, are not properly designed in a manner that is accessible by all. And there is also a barrier of pricing. There is a barrier of costing, and there are the 4th barrier is, there is also a barrier of even getting knowledge of how to operate that. For example, it's not the same to train a blind man and someone who is not blind how to use computer. It is learning mechanisms. So sometimes we think by default that it is possible to train all using the same mechanism. So 4 layers of barriers at least can be explained in relation to the question how to access digital resources, how to access information. So that's why we say that it's a process of removing these barriers, even if we have the conviction to be inclusive. That's why we demand civil society organizations to consider that this is not an overnight action. This is not something that that can be done at once and can be proud of, that we have done inclusion, so we need to be thankful for that. No, it's a process, and we need to work with joining our all hands of all stakeholders. Thank you.
Thanks, Sisay. Just a quick follow-up question on what you mentioned. So do you find any difference in men's access and women's access to information? Men and women with disability, do they have, are there differences in the access?
Yeah. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. I mean, as we all know, women with disabilities are vulnerable to intersectional level of discrimination, or, the fact that they're women by itself limits their access to resources, not necessarily having disability. The fact that they're shouldered with all responsibilities of home related activities. The fact that, the patriarchal dominated system discourages women. Then when it comes to disability, women with disabilities are the most marginalized people. They're being women, and they're having disability will create its own another level of discrimination or disability. In many developing countries, we know that women with disabilities are vulnerable to lots of abuses and violences. So their access to resources, of course, will be very limited, as when there is access, when we create, or when we facilitate a precondition for creating access to resources, there will be a relationship between resource provider and resource receiver, for example. So that relationship can also be a potential source of discrimination for women with disabilities. In some cases, the resource providers may not make equal provision of resources, not in some cases, actually in many cases. So there is a clear difference between men and women with disability itself in matters of getting access to resources. Thank you.
Thanks, Sisay. So from both the speakers, the one common thing that has come up is that social inclusion, it's a process. It's not an overnight concept that we just come up with a design and say it's inclusive. it's actually complicated and complex, and we really need to follow a process, because like Sisay mentioned that there are different barriers, and different, like he described 4 different levels of barriers to access to information and resources. And another thing that he highlighted is that yes, there are ratification of conventions, but when it comes to implementation, there is a difference. And yes, definitely women with disabilities, they are more marginalized as compared to men. And yes, so these are some of the points that yes, definitely we can discuss further. And I request all the participants to please ask questions, as many as you can, in the Q&A section, and it's live on Facebook. So that's what I wanted to inform. Yes, now Irene, our third speaker, will touch upon the unrest that's there in Uganda, in Kampala. So she will be telling us on about the ethnicity inclusion, what it means in Kampala, what's her experience, what she has seen in the governance, what about social cohesion. So yes, over to you, Irene.
Thank you, Sujata, and the rest of my fellow panelists. I'll not really divert from what my fellow panelists have just discussed, because social inclusion is a process where those that have power and the decision maker can influence how certain group of people can be included or excluded within a particular group or within a community. And I'll link social inclusion in discussion to service delivery within Uganda. And I'll first talk about the poverty rate within our different ethnicities, because within Uganda, we have different regions from west to east to south to north, and all these people have different barriers and different challenges that happen within their today life or activity. So when you look at the poverty rate, I'll begin from maybe northern Uganda. When I was trying to go through the poverty rate within our different regions across Uganda, northern Uganda stands at 46%, and the central region stands at 11%. Eastern region is 24%, and Western region is 22%. So when you look at service delivery, it seems it is a process of including people, including different groups of people with different challenges into participation politically, economically, and socially. I would attribute Northern Uganda of having that high percentage due to the different insurgencies that have been happening within Northern Uganda. There have been a lot of conflicts between the National Lord's Army, which has been fighting different groups of people within Northern Uganda. So their process to inclusion is somehow delayed, because we all know that when the insurgencies within a community, it is really hard for such a community to develop. So such communities have difficulties in accessing education, health. So it is really hard for inclusion or social inclusion to take place, because the prevailing circumstance do not allow them to actively participate, that is one, but also the political will, the weak structures that are within the community or within the country does not allow that to happen. Then I'll also raise, but however, now the country is stable, I can confess over that in northern Uganda, and I believe with time, these people will be given opportunity to develop economically, socially, and politically. Then ethnicity inclusion that I observed was in education. Uganda made education free for primary and secondary education. That was in 1997 and 1997 for primary and 2007 for secondary education. And within this formative action, families or children from poor families were given an opportunity to go to school and attend education. So due to that, we can at least see that there's been an increased enrollment within the primary section and within the secondary section. Though when it gets to transition into the university, things tend to be shaky because if you're not able to go to the university on government sponsorship, then your parents have to look for money to educate you, which is a challenge. So when you look at the enrollment in education, especially primary, when I look at the ethnicity inclusion, you can see that Karamoja region is one of the regions that has the lowest enrollment rate in the country, despite the fact that education has been made free, but still children are not able to attend education. The overall enrollment for primary currently is at 80%. But when you look at the enrollment for Karamoja in primary is at 25%. Then the secondary enrollment is at 17% within the Karamoja region. So when you look at such, you really see that some people or some group of people or different ethnicities have not really embraced education. They've not embraced the universal secondary education. Reason because these are some of the communities that still had insurgencies, but they also face a challenge of poverty. They are poor, so they cannot meet some of the basic needs that are required for a child to go to school. I also look at ethnicity inclusion in terms of health. The maternal mortality rate among the children within northern region, within Karamoja region, they are still very low. I was reading a piece of paper this morning. I was able to see that 108 out of 1,000 live births, 108 they die before their first birthday. So it is real, and this is attributed to corruption because the people in charge, the government officers, are not able to follow up on what is happening, on the corruption that is taking place, where some service providers are taking money, they are taking drugs and putting them in their drug stores. They are not follow, even if someone is put under maybe law, they are not able to convict them because of the poor or the weakness of the structure within the government. Because oftentimes I can cite an example of the COVID response fund that we received recently. We received not sure of the amount, but it was some good amount of money. So we can buy oxygen, we can buy beds for patients with COVID-19, but due to corruption, due to tribalism, that there's certain group of people that enjoy with within the national cake. So a lot of people are suffering, but there is no implementation because of COVID task response. So ethnicity inclusion is really a big issue within Uganda, given the fact that where I can attribute it maybe to governance, because there's this belief within community around people that you interact with within my area and within Kampala region, that because President Museveni has stayed long in power, so a lot of the beneficiaries in the country are the people from the Western region. And this has really brought into that, even if today you went and asked for a job and you're not speaking the Western language, you may not be able to get that job. So that is part of the the ethnicity inclusion that is happening within the country. And these people that are stealing, or people that are taking the drugs for the poor Ugandans, are people from this region, and nothing is done about them because they have that autonomy, they have that power. No one can talk about them. Even if you took them to court, of course, they will never rule against them. As a poor person like Irene will still suffer, will still not get the health assistance that is due needed because someone has benefited with what is supposed to be taken to the poor community. So because of these such in ethnicity conflicts within Uganda, you see that social cohesion is eroding because there's a lot of people pushing it to tribalism. People are looking at them, the population is looking at themselves as being deprived, they are discriminated. If you're looking for a job, if you're looking for maybe a service delivery and you do not have money, you can't get it. People are being arrested over nothing. Kidnaps are taking place everywhere, and children are disappearing just like that. The moms are crying, their parents are crying, but irrespective of all that, little has been done. So the erosion is taking place. There is excessive use of power, of authority within the police officers. They arrest you without nothing and they will torture you just because you may be subscribed to a different belief or because you don't believe in what they do. So ethnicity inclusion is really, really high within Uganda. And as my mentioned that it is a process of to call upon maybe to join hands, help curb ethnicity inequalities, then it will be hard for us to achieve social inclusion, because this is equal participation in power, equal participation in development, and some groups of people are not given that opportunity to do so. So it is really challenging. Back to you, Sujata. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Irene. That's really an elaborate description. And you really touched upon so many important aspects like, yes, definitely ethnicity inclusion is a problem, and that mainly it can be attributed to governance. So, yes, so moving ahead, we have a question. Okay, so Kristie has already responded to it. So now I'm over to Kristie. The question that I have in my mind, because yes, we are talking about social inclusion. So what, according to you, what does it mean for us to have these multiple intersecting identities? Because of some we are privileged, and because of others we feel oppressed. So, what's your take on this? So we will just spend 5 minutes each on the second round of questions.
No, thank you. I mean, a good question, because the thing about inclusion is it's not always good, and exclusion isn't always bad. And that's a difficult one to get your head around, I suppose, because in practice, you know, you think if you give someone a seat at the table, that should be a good thing. But if that table is hostile to their ethnicity, their ability, or their sex, that person's not going to feel included. It's going to be a disempowering experience for them. So we have to understand that inclusion is the end goal, but getting there too fast isn't always a good thing. There is a time factor. Both sides, those who are excluded, those who are included, have to understand what the rules of the game are to play it fairly. And if that's not well thought through, then we can not only have disempowerment, but we can have exploitation. We have adverse incorporation. A classic example is the old group mentality where, oh yes, we'll get a woman, she'll be the secretary. She'll take all the notes for our group. She's not going to get paid. She'll have no decision-making rights, but she's included because she has a value to the group in note-taking, not because they actually want women to be a part of the decision-making, not real inclusion, as we say. And why that matters to intersectional inequality and how you include people is because the type of exclusion matters to how the inclusion solution should be formed. So Irene was talking about ethnicity. Now I've got this quote here from Nancy Fraser, because she did a lot of thinking around this, and for her explanation, she said that class injustice, so like wealth issues, that requires redistribution to solve. A cash transfer, a handout, something positive to compensate for years of being excluded from the same opportunity. However, if you have status injustice, which is where the ethnicity comes in, the disabilities come in, because of who you are excluded. Not just because you've missed out because life has moved on, or someone's land got sold, or a road went through your village, but because of who you are, then recognition is needed. And this is where it gets very political, especially when you're talking about group-based rights. And then it gets even more complex when you have groups that have both. And I think that one of the good examples there would be Dalits in the Hindu religion. They're kind of treated as a culture and a group. They're excluded financially, and they're excluded because they're Dalits, which means they're untouchable. So therefore, people in the way they interact with them will exclude them. So there's double disadvantage. So therefore, the way you include them has to be as complex. Things like affirmative action will help recognize Dalits, will help recognize the group that's been excluded, but you don't want to leave it there, because then that can become charity. It can become we're not changing our attitude, we're still being very better than you because we're letting you come in, right? And again, we might exploit you if we don't tackle our own attitude and make you do the notes, for example. So, and then if you have within those groups, you might have Dalits, you have women who are Dalits and men who are Dalits. And then you have disabled women, disabled men who are Dalits. You have those who live close to town, those that live far away, those that are illiterate, those that are literate, those that own some means of production, they might have some land or a shop, those who have nothing. And I suppose one of the examples is around bonded labour. So I was living in Nepal, and the Maoists, with the conflict there, said we're going to free all bonded labourers. So there was, the low castes were working for food, just for food security. There was no income. They couldn't afford to ever leave because there was no potential to accrue wealth. It was just living. And the Maoists said, this is wrong, this is unjust, we're going to free them all, you can do what you want. And a lot of those bonded labourers went back to their landholder and said, can I work with you again? Now, the landholders thought this was hilarious. They thought this shows you how wrong this inclusion agenda is. But it missed the point that it's not just freeing, it's not just changing sometimes what causes exclusion, because there's a history of not being independent that goes with that. There's a history of not having to negotiate on rent that goes with that. There's a history of children watching parents say, yes, sir, the whole time. Never argue back that goes with that. You can't just remove the symptom, I suppose, without really looking at what's caused it. And when you're talking about biases or internal beliefs, some people don't realize they reproduce it. They may not believe it, but they reproduce it because that's just how they've been brought up. Others will actively subscribe and reinforce these exclusion vectors. So it's whether it's within one region, within one exclusion group, within ability, within a country, the solution matters. And I think Irene was mentioning that giving scholarships or making education free in the North didn't encourage school attendance. Why? Possibly because they're too poor to send their children to school. So it wasn't just that money, the cost of school was a barrier. It was the whole survival, where they're at, the whole survival mentality that means they need their children to help out with food security. That going to school is a luxury they can't afford. So it does get complicated, and many policymakers just pull their hair out and try and do good and end up doing bad and then give up. Too hard, I tried, it's not my fault. This is really deeply political. It really is about discussions. It's not a quick fix about put someone in policy making, but yes, they need to be there. It's many different solutions that need to come with the pace of change. I'm a researcher. Inclusion is an experiment. What's going to work varies. We need good data. We need the people who are excluded to be involved. So that's also, there's some things we know have to happen. Doesn't mean we know the result of the experiment yet. It's a work in progress. Thank you. I'll hand it back.
Thanks, Kristie. So again, a statement to underline, inclusion is an experiment. So with this, I take the discussion forward, and I request the panelists if they can answer some of the questions there so that we can just continue with the discussion. Sisay, so the question is, does the media play an important role in challenging or reinforcing the existing social norms or discrimination? Sisay? Okay. We will just wait for Sisay to join again. And so, Irene, a question for you. So, are there any difference in ethnic groups, like to what extent they're represented at the leadership level, and whether it is different for men or women?
Thank you, Sujata, for that beautiful question. There are several groups of minority within Uganda. And according to literature, these minority groups are not represented at the local level, because we have local level at the grassroots, not even represented at the parliamentary level, because they are normally excluded from participation. Although the government of Uganda in the 1995 constitution states that persons like the minority groups have the right to participate and make decisions, this is not given to them because they are overlooked. So they are normally left out, and their literacy level is very low. Their health facilitation is very low. They suffer from poverty, I will quote this tribe within the West, where it is called a Batwa group, which is a minority group, but they have a myth that if you had sexual intercourse with such a person, with a woman within the Batwa, you heal from backache, or you heal from HIV. So these people, the minority groups, are really suffering because of discrimination, and they are excluded within the society because it is a group, a small group of people that are living across the country. Thank you.
Thanks, Irene. That's great. We have two questions from the participants, which are more or less similar. So I request Sisay to respond to these questions before we wrap up this webinar. So the questions are about the measures that we take to for social inclusion. So the first question is, how can we address structural exclusion and discriminatory attitudes and beliefs in practical terms? And the second similar question is, what measures should we put in place for use to effectively bring everyone on board? Sisay, over to you.
Can you, okay. Okay. I think these are very, very important questions. How, if we say that inclusion is a process, how can we bring an immediate solution to stop structural exploitation and to make everyone on board? What can we do? One similar by Kristie as well, what can be done to capacitate African governments to come out of talk on only policy levels. I think it looks like, you know, everyone has his or her own. We need to play our own share. First of all, it's very good to understand what can we play, what can I do? Because from history, what can we learn is that solutions are always brought not by the structure, not by the system. It's by individuals. And of course, it is an era now, it's an era where individuals can have more roles. So I'm not saying that individuals can only bring a change, but the role of individuals is very, very indispensable. For example, someone might come up with an innovative technology to solve a very expensive way of, or a very difficult way of accessing something. That's what happened in regard to digital inclusion, for example. Now, I'm using, for example, a software called NVDA, a computer software called non-visual desktop access. This software is created by Australian blind people who do this not for. If we look into ourselves, we can have something to contribute. I think this should be underlined, because this is not an area that can be waited for. That can be waited for by governments to be answered. Another thing is maybe to use our potential, like we have social organizations, for example, we have community-based organizations. We have like local organizations. If we work with local organizations to enhance their capacity, we can make a lot of change. We have, for example, in terms of disability, organizations of persons with disabilities. In terms of women, the same. Or in terms of other groups, we can have similar kind of, instead of simply making arguments with the government, it might be very good to show what can be done at practical level. What can I do? What can organizations or associations can do? So making everyone to play his or her own share is, I think, a very good solution. In terms of education, yes, now we should, here at Includovate, we have one research that we have conducted with, in collaboration with Africa Action and Light for the World. One of the things that these two organizations are doing is they are not trying to dump what they believe. Rather, they were trying to capitalize the local knowledge, the local efforts, the local expertise, and maybe to make some kind of gearing, like by giving some direction. We have to believe in the power of the family. For example, you could not get compassion, without the family. Now, in one of the Ethiopian universities, we have listening and news that the university is working with families of the local town to accommodate all students who come from different parts of Ethiopia as their own child, So it might be very good to use the untapped force, the untapped social capital that is available in the society, in the community-based organizations, in religious organizations. So it's not good to wait for government. Then when we do that, of course, the government also can learn that, okay, this can be more practical. And instead of simply discussing these on papers and on workshops and on conference halls. So we should bring out issue of inclusion from the halls to the practice, to the field, to the grass field, there to the grassroots level where everyone can play his or her own share. I think, considering time, this is what can I say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sisay. So here we come to the end of today's webinar. And yes, thank you, panelists, for your insights, which was really very informative. And thank you for answering all the questions there. So we touched upon gender inclusion, we touched upon disability inclusion, we touched upon ethnicity inclusion. Yes, number of inclusion. We talked about social inclusion, but you may have observed that though not purposely, but we haven't touched the youth inclusion. So stay tuned. Tomorrow at 4 to 5 p.m. East Africa time, we will be talking about why youth inclusion is important. So stay tuned. Thank you for the participation. Thank you, panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.